In Revelation chapter 17, John sees Mystery Babylon the Great. An angel then begins to explain to him what this metaphoric scene represents. It refers to the end of time, the time when the Antichrist will arise. And of particular note is this passage of Scripture. The angel says there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen and 1 is, and the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue a short space. 7 kings. Who are they? And who will be the 8th king? Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me the mystery and the mystery of Babylon.
And a mystery it is, and we hope to go a little farther toward unraveling it today. Now, J.R., this group of 7 kings, a lot of people have said these are Roman Caesars. That is to say, all 7 would be Caesars of the Roman Empire at one time or another.
Yes, no one has ever been able to figure out just which Roman kings it would be, but that's the general consensus among theologians, that these deal with perhaps the Claudian line, Augustus Caesar, and so on, Julius. But they were not all persecutors of Jews.
That's very true, as a matter of fact.
And there were more Roman kings than just that. Why those?
Yeah, why those indeed? And as a matter of fact, if you look at, say, Julius Caesar, Caesar Augustus, they were not known as persecutors at all. Now, of course, they were very much interested in advancing the cause of the Roman Empire, but they did not persecute God's chosen people. And when we read in Revelation 17:10, this list of 7 kings, 5 are fallen. This is at the time John is writing, which is in the 90s AD, in the 1st century. 5 are fallen, 1 is, and the other is not yet come. This is one of the very few times in the New Testament where a real living person is referred to, this one who is.
Yes, I think we should start there, because in the days of John's exile on the island of Patmos, he was there because of the wicked emperor of the Roman Empire, Domitian. So, Gary, let's start there with the profile of Domitian.
Domitian, he came to power in 81. Now, he was the son of Vespasian and the brother to Titus. Titus is famous for having sacked Jerusalem and destroyed the Second Temple. And when Titus came to power, it was more or less his desire to share power with his brother Domitian. Domitian would have nothing to do with that idea. Very selfish, vain, cruel man. He wanted the rule all to himself, and he took it. As a matter of fact, some people say that he took steps to aid in his brother's quick demise. Titus died of a strange disease. Some say he may have been poisoned on his, what wasn't a sick bed. Maybe he came down with the flu or something, and then he died.
Isn't it ironic that the man who destroyed the Jerusalem temple in AD 70 was poisoned by his own brother?
It really is.
Domitian. And then, of course, Domitian was wicked in his own right.
Very, very wicked. As a matter of fact, the people called him the second Nero, because Nero, back in the earlier days, had persecuted the church. He was the first official, shall we say, persecutor of the church, and he went about it in a big way. But Domitian was called Second Nero, starting in AD 81 until his death in AD 96. He persecuted the church, he tortured them, he hounded them, he did everything he could to make life miserable for them, until shortly before his death, in a kind of a miraculous series of events, certain church leaders were arrested and brought to him, and he asked them personally, what is this church to which you belong, and what are its goals? And they said, well, our kingdom is not of this earth. We're not here to usurp your kingdom. Our kingdom is the kingdom of heaven, and it's an angelic kingdom. At that point, Domitian dismissed these guys out of hand, saying, well, I'm not going to be bothered with this rabble. Get them out of here. Let them do what they want to, as long as they don't interfere with my kingdom. And at that moment, the torture of the church stopped. And simultaneously, the Apostle John, who had been earlier in Domitian's reign, had been arrested, had been boiled in oil, miraculously escaped, exiled on the island of Patmos, was freed from his exile, and went back and became the elder of the church at Ephesus. So that we have a miraculous series of intertwined events here in the late 90s AD.
So we know who the king is that the Scripture says one is.
One is.
One is. So who are the five who are fallen?
Well, J.R., the traditional list of the five, and several men have come up with this over the years, would be that number 1 was Julius Caesar, number 2 was Tiberius, number 3 Caligula, number 4 Claudius, number 5 Nero, number 6, the one who is Domitian. That's the traditional list. But it doesn't scan, because Nero and Domitian were known as persecutors of the church, but the first 3 on this list, the first 3 as usually given, Julius Caesar, Tiberius, and Caligula, were not persecutors of the church. The pattern does not fit.
Now, I want you to notice a clue that is given here in the 17th chapter. Verse 8 says, "The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition." And then it continues in verse 11, "The beast that was and is not, even he is the 8th, and is of the 7." So when we look at this beast of Revelation, which I think is the beast of chapter 13 that rises up out of the sea with 7 heads and 10 horns, with the mouth of a lion, the body of a leopard, the feet of a bear, I see this beast as being far more than just the Roman Empire. In fact, it takes us back to the book of Daniel, doesn't it?
It really and truly
and to
does.
Nebuchadnezzar.
It takes us back to King Nebuchadnezzar, who was called prophetically by Daniel the head of gold, meaning he was the first major Gentile king in a series of kings that would conclude in Roman rule. Now,
and this lion was the symbol of Nebuchadnezzar. So
that's right.
In the 4 beasts that come up out of the sea in Daniel chapter 7, we have first the lion of Babylon, and then we have Medo-Persia represented by the bear, and Greece by the leopard, and then the dreadful beast that is a composite of the others being the Roman Empire. That's the general consensus.
And so when we read in Revelation there are 7 kings, I think it's better. It makes much more sense to go back to the list of kings as actually initiated or originated by the prophecy of Daniel. It makes a great deal of sense. Therefore, number 1 on that list would not be Julius Caesar, but would rather be Nebuchadnezzar, the head of gold. And as we list, we're starting a new list here, number 1 being Nebuchadnezzar. All the people on this list are people who wreaked havoc upon God's chosen people, the Jews, and later on, of course, with the foundation of the church, wreaked havoc upon the church. They all have this in common.
Now, following the Babylonian Empire were the Medes and the Persians, and the first, I guess, of their rulers was Darius.
Darius the Mede.
So he'd be the second on the list.
He would be number 2 on the list, and you say, wait a minute, scratching my head, what did Darius do? Well, we know very well about Darius, if you read Daniel chapter 6.
Yeah. Daniel in the lion's den.
Right.
Throw him in the lion's den. Well, from Darius, then, we go to Greece and Alexander the Great. He has to be number 3 on that list, doesn't he?
That's right, and Alexander, being number 3, was also prophesied by Daniel. And as a matter of fact, he was called the he-goat in the prophecy of Daniel. A very important Grecian king, the most important Grecian king, who set out to rule the world, literally to conquer the entire world, and through a miracle of God, he conquered the world, but not Israel.
Now, he was going to destroy Israel.
Yes, he was.
But because of a dream, he decided to befriend them instead. But he was a perfect type of the Antichrist.
Absolutely.
Because Israel is going to accept the Antichrist just as they accepted Alexander the Great.
And by the way, each of the 7 men, starting with Nebuchadnezzar, then Darius the Mede, and then Alexander, each of these men is a, shall we say, a model of the Antichrist. And the whole list, when we get through with it, you will see, forms a composite picture of the Antichrist.
So we have Daniel and Revelation consorting together. We have to interpret the 2 books together of the Old Testament and the New Testament in order for this picture to emerge. Then, of course, Daniel's little horn would arise out of the Greek Empire. When Alexander the Great died at age 33, he turned his empire over to his 4 generals, one of which was Seleucus.
That's right.
And out of him came the Seleucid dynasty who ruled Syria. And from among that group came the infamous Antiochus IV Epiphanes.
And Syria was more than just what we think of as Syria today. Syria was the entire territory, really, from the Euphrates River across north of into the land that we call Lebanon today, northern Israel, all the way up into parts of Asia Minor. It was a very large rule.
Antiochus Epiphanes, the king of Syria, was the main archetype of the Antichrist as given in the prophecy of Daniel. It was Antiochus Epiphanes who came into Jerusalem and sacrificed a pig on the altar of the temple. And for 3 years, he ruled over Jerusalem. Judas Maccabeus and his army overthrew the Syrians and eventually came back 3 years later to the day and rededicated the temple. This was the little horn of Daniel, according to Flavius Josephus and other Jewish historians of the first century. He is the archetype for the future Antichrist. And it's interesting that he's number 4, Gary, out of the 7, because this makes a servant lamp of a menorah, doesn't it?
It makes a servant lamp. That is, if you've followed our studies on the menorah, you know that the middle or 4th element of the menorah is always the important one. It sets the types and symbols. And J.R., if there was ever a type and a symbol of the Antichrist, it's Antiochus IV Epiphanes,
yes.
A madman. He was, and by the way, this brings up another point that we should make at this moment, and that is that all of the men on this list of 7 have another common feature, and that is at one time or another they are all indwelt by what we might call the spirit of Antichrist, a kind of madness, a megalomaniacal, terroristic madness that compels them to destroy God's plan of redemption. They seem unable to stop themselves, and they all exhibit this strain of madness.
Now, the Seleucids, evidently, this would be the rulers of Syria, would produce the Antichrist, the people of the prince that shall come.
That's right.
Over the centuries, they became associated with the Caesars of Rome. And eventually, of course, comes name number 5, which would be Nero himself.
Nero himself.
He's the first century Antichrist. He's the man that had the Apostle Paul beheaded. But where did he come from? Where are his roots? According to Ludwig's Handbook of New Testament Rulers, Nero's friends were a curious bunch. One in particular, Vitellius, who was a senator who arranged with the Senate to legalize the marriage between Nero's mother and Claudius, was a former governor of Syria. In other words, he was a Seleucid. From Antiochus Epiphanes.
And we find that the progeny of Antiochus Epiphanes were very influential in the royal houses of Rome. We don't have time to go into a complete study. We've written about that in our magazine, Prophecy in the News. But the connections between the Seleucid dynasty and the royal houses of Rome is well documented, and we know that the Antichrist is going to come out of the royal houses of Rome. That is, even today, this bloodline has continued right down to our present day.
And it looks awfully suspicious, Gary, that Nero himself, not a son of Claudius, but a stepson, was actually of Seleucid progeny.
That's right.
So when Vitellius spent his time to put Agrippina with Claudius and bring about a marriage there, he wasn't doing it because he enjoyed it necessarily. There was something in it for him. She must have been somehow related to him.
And we have the birth and accession of Nero, the monster persecutor of the church, and he is number 5 on our Hall of Shame list, I guess we could call it. Nebuchadnezzar, number 1. Darius, number 2. Alexander the Great, number 3. Antiochus IV Epiphanes, number 4. And then we have a direct bloodline connection, we believe, between Antiochus and Nero. Nero, this man, J.R., cruel, arrogant, self-possessed. He, at first, during the first part of his reign, he was known as a very sensitive, sort of a loving character. He was a musician, a performer. He wrote poetry. People liked him. But he got the idea that he was a god, and as his reign progressed, he became progressively insane. And I think that I suppose a contemporary psychiatrist might call him and saying what I think is that he was indwelt by that evil spirit. 1 John chapter 4 speaks of it as the spirit of the Antichrist. And it's a spirit that has been lurking down through the ages and will one day indwell the final Mr. Antichrist.
And in Hebrew, Nero's name adds up to 666. You would have to use the title Caesar and Nero. In the Hebrew, the very Hebrew letters that make up the word Caesar, Nero, would be in Hebrew Gematria 666.
When Nero died, it was because he had to flee for his life, basically. He hid out. He committed suicide. And because of the kind of obscure nature of his death, the theory arose that he would rise again and come back as Antichrist. As a matter of fact, this theory is called in Latin Nero redivivus, and it was believed that he would one day return. As a matter of fact, the belief that Nero would return as Antichrist was still in existence in the 5th century A.D., because Augustine, in his book City of God, makes a reference to Nero, saying, quote, "Others again suppose that Nero is not even dead, but that he was concealed, and that he might be supposed to have been killed, but that he really now lives in concealment in the vigor of that same age which he had reached when he was believed to have perished, and will live until he is revealed in his own time and restored to his kingdom." That's Augustine wrote that in the 5th century. And you know, J.R., as late as the days of the Reformation in the 16th century, there were still Christians who held the Nero redivivus theory. They believed Nero was coming back. But in fact, Nero gave way to, as we have already talked about, second Nero, who was Domitian. And Domitian did his best to be as cruel as Nero ever had been. So now we have the first six places.
All set up.
All set up. We have 6 places, starting with Nebuchadnezzar, Darius, we have Alexander, followed by Antiochus Epiphanes, followed by Nero, followed by Domitian. And we're going to put this list on your screen so you can read it along with us.
Now, the seventh one has to be a persecutor of the Jews.
He does.
And he has to be demonically possessed.
Yes.
And think himself to be a god. And down through the past 2,000 years of history, we haven't really had anybody who adequately fills the bill until this century.
That's right. As a matter of fact, after Domitian, there was never another official persecution of the Jews and the church. By the way, Nero and Domitian both persecuted both groups equally. But this man is referred to in Revelation 17:10 by this phrase, "And when he cometh, he must continue a short space." In our own century, we have a man who rose in Germany, and he was a persecutor of Jews and Christians, by the way. And his name was Adolf Hitler, and he came in the shadow of the Caesars. He tried to model the Third Reich after the empires of the Roman Caesars.
So let's put him as number 7 on the list. That brings us then to number 8. Number 8 is the beast that rises out of the sea in chapter 13.
That's right.
With 7 heads and 10 horns, this would be a revived Roman Empire. A world kingdom, and the leader of this world kingdom, even he is the 8th, and he is the one that's going into perdition. But the clue here is he is of the 7. Which one of these 7 is he? Will he be Nero?
Nero. You know, that name is a name to conjure with, Nero. He was a public performer. He was a man who was known to have the power to sway people. He was a musician who was a born performer. He was I guess you'd call him a ham. In addition to that, he was a megalomaniac. He just thought the whole world revolved around him. And later, in his reign, he became possessed of, let's call it the spirit of the Antichrist. And he imagined that he was God. As did Domitian. Domitian wanted himself to be referred to as Lord and God. And by the way, Hitler thought of himself as deity as well. So, J.R., this is the kind of man we're looking at as Mr. Number 8.
Somewhere, sometime, perhaps in the near future, someone will emerge with the characteristics of Nero. When he does, watch out. He may be the Antichrist.